If we are individuals for whom relationships are just added on, adventitious to who we really are, rather than being persons who are born related and who exist always in relationship, then we would start with rights alone and not with the duties or obligations to others that are part of our assertion of our own rights. Since rights have to be protected, we get then into a legal framework that is almost always, unfortunately, adversarial. Someone wins and someone loses in a court of law. Society then becomes brittle and sometimes violent. Natural community, such as marriage, is also much weakened when it's just seen as something that can be unchosen. People's mobility and the pursuit of one's own dreams, even if they bring one into conflict with others, becomes something of a priority in the whole culture. This doesn't foster the kind of relationship that is necessary to live humanely. So the book considers the relationships that establish our fundamental identity. The ideology of individualism manifests itself in various ways. Violence is the most obvious, and that, of course, is in our political philosophy after Hobbes, and even after Locke to some extent. The modern state is an attempt to reduce the violence of the natural state. The Church's sense of natural law, natural moral law, is to say that naturally we are social animals. We are born communitarians, not individuals. And so Hobbes had it wrong. And even though our kind of social contract state depends upon him, behind it there is a civil society that is much more communitarian, and that the Church, particularly today, is concerned about strengthening. The ideology of individualism manifests itself in various ways. Violence is the most obvious. Modern culture is sometimes based upon opposition and contention. The media needs to have oppressors and victims, or else there isn't a story. Courts are set up for winners and losers. Business thrives on competition, which is sometimes cutthroat. And politics opposes those in power to those who have lost power. And so we find ourselves surrounded by conflicts, some of them necessary, some of them created, but it's a very conflictual kind of situation in which we work out our growing into these relationships. The Church's role is to say, while there is certainly conflict in life and at certain levels, the highest level, the very highest level, is one of harmony and peace, of mutual love inspired by the love of God. Our mission as a church is to call people to that level, which isn't only higher but also more global. So it's not just relationship to God, but again, to everything that God has created. It's more universal. It doesn't mean we always live there. You have to live where we are at different levels. But if you know there is that level, where in the end all will be well, as Julian of Norwich wrote, where in the end God will show us how history is woven in such a way that he has continuously brought good out of evil. The evil is real, but in the end God is able to bring good out of it. If we don't live in faith at least, but also to some rational conviction that there is that level of reality, then we inevitably lead ourselves into a kind of a cynicism that destroys relationships. The institutional relationship between church and state is, in the United States, the constitutional way of talking about what is far deeper, namely the relationship between faith and culture, which is the way that Pope John Paul II used to raise the question. And I, through knowing Pope John Paul and talking to him and studying his works, have tried to explore that relationship between faith and culture, and you'll see that in the book as well. Because if you don't have that figured out, then the church-state relationship, which is, after all, a relationship between institutions. But if behind the institutions there isn't a society where faith and culture are talking to one another, you can't resolve the institutional question very well. You'll have to become just winners and losers in a court of law. But if you get it to a different level of faith and culture and the way in which necessarily they relate to one another, there's no abstract pure faith that doesn't express itself culturally in some language and customs, and there's no culture that, unless it's totally closed in upon itself, doesn't have to find some transcendent opening so that it cannot be a trap, but rather a way of relating to people who don't share that same culture. And it's the church's job to help cultures to enter into dialogue between themselves, because it brings them into dialogue with the faith. That's basic to the magisterium, the teaching of Pope John Paul II, and to the vision of the world that he had. And the world caught on. I was present at the funeral of Pope John Paul II. And all of us were amazed. The whole world showed up. Not just the governments, as you have in the United Nations, not just people who are interested in a cultural phenomenon, as you might have in a global concert at times that is now possible because of the means of communication that are ours. The whole world showed up. Every country, every religion, every culture, every race. They were all there. And I think that they were all there because he had this enormous vision that enabled him to talk to everybody, which he did, and not only just have them talk to him, but through him and through the message he proclaimed to talk to everybody else. And people kind of sensed that at the end. Even when they resented some of his positions, even when he was caricatured, even when he made mistakes, which he did, as we all do. Nonetheless, behind it there was that conviction that in the end it will be well, because God will see to it that we are able to come together in faith, or in a faith at least that enables us to talk to people who don't share that faith. If we forget that we're born social beings, first of all, and we begin to think that we're fundamentally antagonistic beings in competition with others in order to establish our rights or fulfill our own dreams, then there are many separations, including that between church and state, that become antagonistic rather than cooperative. Besides promoting social violence and justifying institutional conflict, the ideology of pure individualism undermines the natural institution, not created by the church, not created by the state, the natural institution that is marriage. And neither church nor state has the right to change the nature of that institution. It predates both. Certainly one chooses freely to marry someone, but once marriage is contracted, that relationship is normative for the rest of one's life. Marriage means growing not only to live with someone, but also through someone else, having their self-consciousness become part of one's proper self-consciousness. My mom choosing clothes for my dad in Field's men's store. Living through a spouse, and we don't often talk about it. We talk about living with, we talk about living in, but the book is primarily concerned about living through, because not enough attention has been paid to it. And the epilogue, which is the most theoretically complex chapter, was precisely done to give some kind of theoretical context to the lived experience of the various relationships that I depict in the rest of the book. Living through a spouse in marriage leads us, with St. Paul, to discover the relationship between Christ and the church. It's a spousal relationship. He's the bridegroom of the church, as we read in the captivity epistles. That means, as St. Paul tells us, we have the mind of Christ, like my mother had my father's mind in hers. As baptized believers gathered into Christ's body, we bring into our self-consciousness everyone whom Christ loves and died to save. Even if we don't know them personally, of course we don't. But we recognize there's a relationship to them. We can't count anyone out. Here comes everybody, as James Joyce said about the Catholic Church, even though he counted himself out. The church is a network of relationships called communion in technical theological terms, and the human race is a network of relationships called solidarity in the vocabulary of John Paul II. So there's a relationship between that global communion that is the church and that global community, which is the human family, in solidarity. The two should complement one another. At that point, there's no separation. There is cooperation, mutuality based on a recognition of differences. So it's not a community that suppresses the differences. We're all the same under the skin. We're not. There are very, very important differences that you can't ignore, or else you're not talking to somebody. But you have to treat the differences as gifts rather than obstacles, so they can become themselves the basis for relationships, even when all the differences aren't shared.